Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 news. Rumours are emerging that Red Bull senior figures are seriously concerned following the departure of Adrian Newey about what this means for their chief rival at Ferrari. Fred Vasseur, Lewis Hamilton, Charles Leclerc and potentially Adrian Newey joining that outfit has reportedly scared senior Red Bull figures into believing what the future might actually look like in terms of the competitive landscape in Formula 1, not just for 2026, but also potentially as soon as next season. Is this the ends of the Red Bull dominance? Can they see this coming? Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I'd greatly appreciate it. It is the Imola Grand Prix weekends, of course, 30 years on since Ayrton Senna passed away at that circuit, and this is the helmet design for Pierre Gasly this weekend. It's kind of common that we see helmet designs that are inspired by events or people or ideas or whatever the case may be. It's relatively rare that you see a design which is, you know, in some sense a replica of Senna's famous helmet, of course. So this is what it looks like in the car, and I'm sure this is going to look spectacular on track, so I thought very fitting. We also have various upgrades though this weekend. I believe that Alpine might not be bringing any. The theory goes that basically every team will bring something, whether that's minor or major, that's another question. Even McLaren probably have one or two other things they want to try, but it's not going to be the major package they brought, of course, to Miami, whereas it is going to be for Ferrari. Sauber are bringing new things as well to try and improve their car and their pit stop equipment. It's been a bit better lately because they found a short-term solution where they can accept a 4-second stop, but if they try and push any faster, you know, the wheel nut gets stuck on and it's an absolute disaster, as we've seen at the first couple of races of the season. So they've kind of managed to resolve that to some degree, but still losing a good 2, 3, 4 seconds of lap time, you know, over the course of a Grand Prix is not ideal. So they're going to change their pit stop equipment, we believe, for Imola to try and resolve this, but it's not really going to make their car any faster, and that's the problem with those pit stop issues, is that it's taken away focus from actually improving on their car. That is what Haas are intending to do. They have more upgrades for Imola. They're going to use the practice sessions to test them side by side, apparently, to see whether they're working as intended. And also Yuki Tsunoda made an interesting comment lately on just the performance of the RB. I think many were concerned, maybe understandably at the start of the season, given how dominant the RB19 was and how close the relationship is this year in terms of car parts between the RB and last year's Red Bull, and many, you know, thought, maybe understandably, that they were going to turn up to the first race and be up there competing with the front of the field. Not the Red Bulls, but, you know, potentially competing for the podium. That didn't happen. They were far away, really, but Tsunoda's done a stellar job so far this season, and honestly, a P7 result at Miami, very impressive indeed. Arguably, they were the 4th fastest car that weekend. Given what Daniel Ricciardo was also capable of in the sprint race, and substantially faster than the Aston Martin. So Tsunoda says, yeah, maybe we can become, you know, at least catch up to the 5th fastest team at some point. Maybe they're already there. We'll see, I suppose, in Imola whether the struggles for Aston Martin continue with the upgrades they brought, which again didn't really seem to work. The upgrades that did work, though, most certainly were for McLaren, and Lando Norris has been very gung-ho on his belief that they can challenge for the championship next year, and of course fight for more wins from now to the end of the season. The same belief is not there for Mercedes. They have upgrades on the works, but they don't believe it's going to be enough to catch Red Bull. I think, you know, they've given up hope at this point, and really their attention may be turning to 2026 and how they possibly try and attract Max Verstappen for that year. We believe that Toto Wolff is going to try and get Helmut Marko on board. We'll discuss more on him in a second, and maybe would also be interested in Adrian Newey. I mean, who wouldn't be? But Mercedes are far from the top of the list. Reports happened a couple of weeks ago now that Newey apparently doesn't especially rate Toto Wolff as a team principal and believes that Mercedes are too far gone to be easily saved in this circumstance. They split their upgrade package partly for Miami, so their floor, their front wing flaps, their front suspension fairings and their high temperature vents on the hood, they debuted those in Miami. But the other parts of the upgrade package, the new rear wing and the new beam wing at the rear of the car, they didn't put on the car in Miami. They will do such a thing in Imola. So you can sometimes find that an upgrade package, if it's not complete, it doesn't really produce the performance that you'd hope for, because, you know, you introduce an upgrade package as a totality, so if you make changes elsewhere and don't change other things, it can affect the car. There is a theory that the rear suspension, they changed this year, right, from pull rod to push rod to kind of copy the Red Bull approach effectively. Ferrari are now the only team not to have adopted that model, actually, because they believe that there's still enough advantage in the pull rod rear suspension to make it work. But the feeling is that some of the issues that have been plaguing Mercedes this year in terms of optimal tyre temperature Leclerc, and potentially the same for Aston Martin, may have been contributed to by the new suspension design they've brought. And they're not changing that here at Imola, actually. They are, however, changing the rear and the beam wing at the back of the car to try and get a more stable rear, which, James Allison said they'd solved in Bahrain, but that clearly is not the case over the last few races. Red Bull will bring a substantial upgrade. Ferrari, the feeling is they will need to unlock 4/10 from this Imola package if they want to be competitive. That's kind of the delta that it's been so far this season on average between those two teams. But Red Bull aren't going to stand still either. Helmut Marko said they're expecting a lot from this update, and as we saw yesterday, it is rather possible that they were turning down their performance in Miami because they were suffering with an underlying issue that may not affect them in Imola, and therefore they've got more performance in the tank, as we, for example, saw in China. But while McLaren were the team to watch of last weekend's, certainly from now and potentially into the future, Ferrari are the team to watch for the time being, because Ferrari have made it very clear they reckon their upgrades are going to work very well. They think they can challenge Red Bull this season. They think they can take several wins from now to the end of the year, and who knows what they're going to be capable of next season, right? We see this relatively frequently. A regulation cycle comes to the end, and on the final year, that can be the most competitive year. It does depend somewhat, because in 2026, there's going to be so much focus on those cars that the teams will give up developing the 2025 cars at some point, probably very early, especially if Red Bull are still on top. But at the same time, the final year, the upgrades, you're reaching a level of performance ceiling that isn't possible to really surpass in theory, so it should be a more competitive championship next year than this year. And this year, okay, Max Verstappen's still probably going to win, but it's not absolutely guaranteed that he wins every single race, as was the case last season. And Ferrari say they can take several wins this year. McLaren and Norris say they can win more races this year. Will that be enough for a championship fight? Helmut Marko said, well, Norris is looking good. We were genuinely slower than McLaren in Miami, but he's 50 points adrift. So it ain't going to happen, buddy, was effectively the point that was made. These are the extent of the Ferrari upgrade as well that we can see on the surface. Images from Giuliano de Kessa. So this change to the floor edge, as we can see right about here. There's the change to the side pod, of course, which caused lots of talk yesterday. This was the older version with the underbite. Now they've got what looks like more of an overbite going on. This also was the side-by-side comparison of the rear wing change. I mentioned yesterday that it looked different, not just because the HP logos are splashed on there, which does look horrible, but whatever. If it's fast, it's fast. And you guys can clearly see the edge of the rear wing. There's a quite substantial change to the design. Looks much more aggressive to my very untrained eye than the previous version does. Whether that makes it fast is another question. The simulator data clearly says that it does. And over the last 12-18 months, what Ferrari have said is going to happen genuinely tends to happen. That Japan upgrade last year, and usually at that point in the season, in the Bonotto era and even before, upgrades they brought would not necessarily do what they wanted or expected them to do, and the Ferrari hopium from the Tifosi would shortly die out. But it's understandable that people aren't looking at this Ferrari upgrade and saying, oh, well, classic Ferrari. They're talking about all these tenths of improvements. It ain't going to happen. There's genuine confidence from within and outside of the team that what they say may actually go, which has not been the case in some time, especially if they can further strengthen their technical department. I think it's quite clear that since Fred Vasseur's come in, he's really got on top of some of the politics. I think you're never going to fully separate Ferrari Formula 1 team, Scuderia Ferrari, and the politics of Maranello and, just Ferrari in general. It's always been something that has to be managed, how involved the main Ferrari outfit wants to get into the Formula 1 team, and all these other problems. But at the end of the day, John Elkann and Fred Vasseur seem aligned on the reality that if they want to get back to the top, they've got to have the autonomy to behave in the way that they want to, and Fred Vasseur showing that can certainly pay off. He's signed Loic Serra, top Mercedes engineer. He's coming over from next year. Lewis Hamilton, of course, has been the major signature of the last few months, damning to Mercedes, but massively beneficial to Ferrari, and it's very clear that there's loads of engineers that are really keen to join Ferrari right now to work with Hamilton, and quite possibly to work with Adrian Newey. And this has been the big discussion, right? Because him leaving Red Bull is one thing, that will hurt them to some extent. Red Bull say it probably won't, but even Helmut Marko admits in a second here that whenever they had problems, it was pretty much Newey that would be the first to come up with the answer to the questions. So even if they can still produce competitive cars, losing the greatest designer in the sport is always going to hurt. The question is, does it hurt doubly, as in, does he go to another team? If he retires, then sure, Red Bull take theoretically a hit, but it might not be enough, right? Newey goes on to do whatever, just sail his boat around the world, and he chills out. No other team gains that knowledge and that experience, and the reality that basically every single new iteration of the rule set, let's say 1998, 2009, and 2022, that Newey's been involved on these projects very hands-on, those respective teams have found something that other teams haven't under the guide of Newey. So is Newey going to go to another team? And if he does, is it going to be Ferrari? And what are the implications of that? A very interesting video that the race did a couple of days ago. Now, I couldn't really find an accompanying article to this, so I'll just share a couple of the highlight clips of the video on where they mention their sources are telling them that Newey is widely believed to be joining another team. And I think this is relatively evident, as they mention, by the fact that he negotiated this exit from Red Bull. If he was convinced he wanted to step away and retire, and every interview that I've heard from Newey has not made it clear at all in my mind that that is what his plan is to do, why would he have negotiated this early exit and whatever potential leverage he used to get that deal done? There's then feeling from in the paddock apparently that, yeah, Ferrari makes by far the most sense. And then there is the implication as to what this means for Red Bull.
Newey does need to decide whether he wants to stay in F1 as part of the new challenges he says he seeks, but it's widely understood in the F1 paddock that he wouldn't have tried to negotiate so hard for an early exit if he didn't have some kind of next move in mind. First, he's seeing off the Red Bull RB17 hypercar project, probably going to travel with his wife for a bit, and then is widely expected to get back down to business. Ferrari is widely believed to be by far the most appealing move. No deal has been done, but Newey reportedly met with Ferrari team boss Fred Vasseur in London in the week before the Miami Grand Prix. And extremely well-placed sources are convinced that Ferrari will win him over by basically offering a pot of gold and a freewheeling role that lets him get as involved as much as he wants. The F1 paddock's getting carried away with excitement at the prospect of a new super team. And even senior Red Bull figures have privately told us that if Vasseur stays on top of Ferrari's infamous politics, that project is looking like a serious threat. Newey would be a massive addition to a team that has gained serious momentum over the past 12 months.
So occasionally there's talk about a super team where it's kind of trying to echo what Ferrari had in the Schumacher days with Ross Brawn and Jean Todt and, bringing that back to some degree. And maybe Ferrari will get there at some point. But it's just the general feeling around Maranello. Fred Vasseur's on top of things. Ferrari are genuinely making progress on and off the track. They're, Xavi Marcos, the race engineer for Leclerc that was getting a lot of flack, shall we say, over the last couple of years. He's now gone. They're bringing somebody else in, Inaki Rueda, who was their strategy guy, often blamed for many of the strategic blunders Ferrari made over the last few years. He's gone now from the role that he was in. Operationally, strategically, Ferrari have improved. They're not perfect, they're not Red Bull racing, but their pit stops are second place to Red Bull basically nowadays. Strategically, they've made some good calls over the last season and a half. Things do seem to be moving in the right direction, and they can build a better car now than they could in 2020. Probably best not to talk about that season if you're a Tifosi. So a very interesting comment, I thought, that senior Red Bull figures have privately told journalists, including the race it seems, that they are genuinely concerned about the prospect of what Ferrari are building, certainly for 2026. We know that Ferrari are always going to put together a good engine. It may explode from time to time, but it is going to be fast. And this season, their reliability has been impeccable. Every single race, Ferrari have had both drivers in the points, whether that was Behrman or whether that was Leclerc and Sainz. Very impressively, no other team has done that so far this season. Just goes to show the reliability and the consistency that Ferrari are bringing to the table nowadays that they were not previously. So Red Bull seem concerned, scared, whatever you want to say. And look, it is the cycle of sport. You're not going to dominate forever, but it does seem like if Red Bull see one team as their biggest threat, they probably deem that to be Ferrari, and that makes a fair bit of sense. Of course, it could also be hurt to Red Bull if others leave. Mark Priestley, he's been around a long time as a mechanic at McLaren, now he's a broadcaster. He says that several other figures are very close to leaving with Newey. Now, who those several other figures are, that's a debate, just because we're pretty sure that Pierre Wache is going to stay. We're pretty sure that Enrico Balbo and Ben Waterhouse, the other top technical heads at Red Bull, we believe they're going to stay and have locked in longer term deals. Certainly with Wache, that seems to be the case. There's been talk about Jonathan Wheatley, who's their sporting director. He might want to pursue a team principal role elsewhere, and now might be a time to do so. Helmut Marko as well is the other question mark, although we did hear from Oliver Mintzlaff, who look, he is Red Bull GmbH managing director. He doesn't know everything about the Formula 1 project, so maybe take it with a bit of a grain of salt, but he says, yeah, there's no way Marco's leaving for Mercedes, which is, of course, what Toto Wolff would like, because if Marco were to leave Red Bull to join Mercedes, that would, we believe, open a clause in Verstappen's contract to depart whenever he likes, and we are pretty sure that Verstappen is very loyal to Marco and may well follow him to Mercedes if that was to be the case, because of their prospects in 2026, when theoretically they probably have a stronger engine project in the works right now than Red Bull do, designing their own effectively for the first time without the help of Honda. So Mintzlaff says, yeah, no way Marco's leaving for Mercedes, but that does not necessarily rule out the possibility of Marco leaving. And actually himself, Marco did say and comment on the Adrian Newey situation and why it's pretty bad for Red Bull, and also where he might go next. We know that Marco is pretty open with the media about this type of stuff. So this is what he had to say. He'd made a comment the other day that said Newey would look great in a colour like green, which seemed to be a hint that maybe Aston Martin could be on the cards, but then he clarified and said, no, that was misunderstood. I would rather guess red, which is obviously very explicit, saying, yeah, if I think Newey's going anywhere, it's probably going to be Ferrari, and the general feeling is that, yeah, Newey ain't going to retire. He might step away, but I think he will come back to work in the sport, and Ferrari makes the most sense. Marco agrees. He then goes on to talk about actually how for the team it's not the end of the world, but yeah, this is kind of the quote that I was mentioning earlier. Newey is a legend. He's the best F1 designer, and he was at his best when the regulations were changed, because he always knows how to best utilize the new interpretations. And with Newey, you've got a figurehead. With him on board, it's much easier to get young engineers, because it was an honor for them to work with him. On the other hand, our technical team is very broadly based, with a mixture of experienced people like Pierre Wache and younger people, which is kind of the Horner angle. This is, Newey, it's not a big deal. We've got a great technical team. But then Marco says, when there were problems, Newey was often the first to come up with a solution, right? So it kind of does show the respect, but also the concern that Newey leaving raises, and maybe Max Verstappen feels similarly as well. So it's very difficult to say whether Hamilton joining Ferrari and, Fred Vasseur, of course, they know each other very well, with Charles Leclerc as well, and maybe Adrian Newey in addition, and Loic Serra coming from Mercedes, is going to build a super team at Ferrari, as we have seen a couple of decades ago. But, they're going to give it a go, right? And maybe understandably why Red Bull are concerned, not necessarily for this year's championship, but next year could be very competitive, and certainly in 2026, the feeling is that there will be a changing of the guard, and Ferrari are the most likely to take over that reign. I did just want to mention this, that a couple of guys pointed out to me here yesterday, just a kind of theory really, on what may happen, let's say in 2025 or 2026, based on the driver pairings and the driver lineup. If McLaren want to fight for wins and a title in 25, they will have to produce a car that would be at least 2/10 quicker than Red Bull and Ferrari. It's the only way that Norris and Piastri can win titles. No way they can beat Verstappen, Hamilton and Leclerc in equal machinery. Now, I'm not so sure I agree with this full statement, but I do think it's worth thinking about. Let's say Red Bull, McLaren and Ferrari next year were the 3 championship contenders. They all had a car that was exactly the same on paper. Obviously, that would never be the case. One will have a performance edge, but even let's just say they're the same on average, and some are better at some tracks, some are better at other tracks. What happens in the season? Who wins? My feeling is that Verstappen wins if he has Perez as a teammate, for example, because Hamilton and Leclerc and Norris and Piastri are going to take more points off each other than Perez, for example, would take off Verstappen. Now, if Verstappen's teammate was Alonso, I think it's a very different story. But, Verstappen with Perez, theoretically, I think it's very hard for Hamilton Leclerc to win the drivers. I think I would bet on Ferrari to win the constructors in that moment, and I'd probably predict the championship to look something like Verstappen, Hamilton, Leclerc, Norris, Piastri, Perez, or whatever, if the cars were all the same. But I personally do think Norris is very fast. Piastri is fast as well on a lap, but in terms of race pace, I think there is something still to be said on his driving style, affecting, hurting the tyres more than Norris's does. So, I don't agree with Zach Brown's opinion that Norris and Piastri is the best lineup on the grid. I think it will be Hamilton Leclerc from next season, and I would put Norris and Leclerc in a pretty similar category to me. Both very fast, both in qualifying and the race. I think Leclerc's race pace is very much underrated, to be honest, given people consider him to be like a qualifying god, which he is, but his tyre management and race pace is something that seems to go under the radar to me. But in terms of consistency, that is the point really. Norris has won one race. I don't know if Norris can be as consistent, and Leclerc, he is prone to the odd mistake, I would say, and I'm not sure that I'm convinced that's been resolved yet, especially in a championship fight, in a championship winning car. So I still think for me, it would be Hamilton, Verstappen would be the 2 main contenders, but it would be fascinating to see how Leclerc and Norris would fare if they all had equal machinery. But those are just some thoughts on my side, and also I guess to mention this on the Piastri side, races before first Grand Prix win, Norris slots in here at 110, Sainz had to wait 150 Grand Prix, Perez had to wait 190, which is kind of remarkable. I think Rosberg was 111, maybe something like that. But the next driver, on paper, you'd probably think is going to be Piastri on the grid as it stands, given the strength of that car. It would be theorised that Piastri probably gets on this list somewhere in the near future, but very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.